The Brendan O'Connor Show on RTE Radio 1 with All Care Pharmacy. Advice and expertise on the relief you need from hay fever at All Care community pharmacies across Ireland.
Welcome back to the programme. Well, if, like me, your dreams of an Olympic medal are long, long gone, you may nonetheless be inspired by all of our athletes and indeed by all of the games to do that little bit more. And I'm delighted to be joined in studio by Professor Niall Moynagh, School of Health and Human Performance in DCU. You're very welcome, Niall. You couldn't but be uplifted just listening to Joel and Mary and Michael there.
It was just absolutely fantastic to hear that story. And, you know, we're in Ireland, we're one big parish, you know, and their story resonates with us all. And, you know, as I was sitting listening to it, I just thought about, particularly for women's sport in this country, it's only 60 years ago that we sent our first female athlete. And that was Maeve Kyle from Kilkenny. And she told me herself she paid her fare to go to Melbourne. To think about that. Yeah. To go to your first, imagine today asking someone to pay their fare to go and represent Ireland in the Olympic Games. So we've come a long way, and in fact I would say in the last quarter of a century the best athletes across all sports that we've produced have been females. And just on that, just speaking of parishes, let's look to your own, to DCU. Like, incredible that there are 10 current students or former graduates who went out to the Olympics. Like, that is fantastic. Yeah, it's a credit to one person, and that's the coach, the former coach of the athletics team, Enda Fitzpatrick. I mean, he came in 2006, and I think that within 15 years he'd won more medals than all the other universities had in 100 years. You know, phenomenal coach, but very, very athlete-centred, and athletes love that type of a coach, and it just shows what can actually be done in Ireland if you really put the structures in place. Yeah, and look, I mean, you know, all of our Olympic heroes, you know, we're constantly thinking of medals, but so many of the athletes, and a lot of them gone out for the first time, like so young, have acquitted themselves so well just by getting there and just even in defeat showing just such a winning attitude, because we forget that it isn't a straight line. You know, there's a lot of peaks and troughs when you're... Yeah, I wish the average punter, you know, watching, you know, TV at night really understood, number one, how difficult it is to even get there. So these people are all success, every one of them. It reminds me, a number of years ago, we ran a course for kids who were deselected, had gone to England to play professional soccer, were deselected and come back, and they all felt failures. And I kept saying to them, you're the 0.1% that actually made it to go to play in the Premier League or get the opportunity. It's the same with these. I mean, when you look at all nations on earth, particularly athletics, like every country in the world can jump, throw, catch. For our athletes to be able to be competing in athletics at the Olympic Games is phenomenal for such a small country. So I think we should big round of applause for all of the athletes, you know, male and female, who managed to actually even get to the Olympic Games. Yeah, look, I mean, it's been absolutely extraordinary. And as I say, I've just been watching all the video clips of, you know, they're interviewed straight away afterwards. You know, they're under huge pressure, and the attitude that comes through is just absolutely phenomenal. Andrew Corcoran, really, he was amazing. I mean, I'll never forget, he said, I ran 3:35. He looked up at the clock, I ran 3:35, and I wasn't even in the race. You know, it just shows you the level that these guys are at. They're all genetic freaks, and so for our guys to be competing at that level, I think it's absolutely phenomenal, and we should be proud of them all. Yeah, I did, and I wanted to put a big hug around Natalia Coyle just after. It was just so... Well, it's funny you mentioned Natalia. She was my pick for a gold medal, certainly a medal, because she has been competing globally and winning global medals for the last 3 to 5 years. So she was going to be my surprise. You know, people were saying to me, who do you think is going to surprise us? It was her, and it was heart-wrenching. And when you look at the German athlete who was winning, who was ready for the gold medal, and the horse just wouldn't move. I mean, the vagaries of sport, you know what I mean? Obviously, and it's disappointing to hear that the person in charge of the pentathlon is not blaming the horses, he's blaming the athletes this morning, which is absolutely terrible. No, and of course, you know, have to blame our 19th century soldiers for giving us, or the Greeks, for giving us the pentathlon in the first place. I want to talk to you about those of us who aren't in that, the 1% of the genetic freaks who can qualify and go to Olympics. But, you know, it seemed to me that at the start of the pandemic, after the initial lockdown, you know, look, the one thing that we could do was exercise, and it became so important, and we really realised for both our physical and mental health how important that was. And there seemed to have been, to borrow the parlance, there seemed to be a surge in activity since, but actually it seems to have fallen off. You know, the COVID stones might be creeping back up. Are we getting enough exercise, and what is enough? Well, even prior to the pandemic, as a nation, we weren't getting enough physical activity. You know, the data showed that. In fact, alarmingly, the most recent survey shows that only 1 in 10 prepubescent and adolescent kids meet the minimum physical activity a day, which is 60 minutes. For sure, if you're between the ages of 10 and 18, so only 1 in 10, and it's even worse for girls. For adults, it's around 50% up to the age of 40, and then it just drops off. So by the time we get to 70 years of age, only 18 to 20% of people are getting the minimal amount, which is, they say 30 minutes of walking or 10,000 steps a day. You know, if someone wants to know whether they're active or sedentary, if you're taking less than 5,000 steps a day, you're sedentary. And we need to find ways. And you know, the pandemic was a wake-up call for many of us. What the global statistics show is that globally, our weights went up and our physical activity levels decreased. And the activity levels decreased the most in the people who were the most active because they couldn't get to the gyms anymore. So for them, that was a huge shift.
And we all have wearable devices and we all have our watches and everything that are tracking us. But that arbitrary, that 10,000 steps a day, you know, people are kind of going mad trying to get their last 300 and 500 steps in. I certainly was. But is it a magical formula for stopping weight gain or for increasing activity, you know, and presumably for different age groups?
Yeah.
The requirements might be different as well.
No, it's not a magical formula. In fact, and that's a very good point, a paper published recently showed that women over the age of 70, that they get no added benefit if they walk beyond 7,000 steps a day. So as we get older, we probably need less than, but very importantly, as we get older though, more so than steps, is that we need to start doing exercises that maintains our muscle mass. Because if we start losing our muscle and our bone, we will lose our functional independence, and no person wants to do that.
Yeah, and especially when we're living longer as well. So what, look, and just to go back to that, you know, thing about, you know, young women in particular, because we all know that once they hit puberty, once they're in school, then sports, there's a lot of attrition, young girls drop out, and perhaps that's why our female athletes at the Olympics are even more important for that reason. Yeah,
and you know, to circumnavigate that question, look at the Olympics, look at the new sports. Look at the wall climbing, the surfing, the skateboarding. I mean, if I was an 8-year-old kid and I was watching that, and lots of kids, particularly girls and many boys, I'd say 80% have absolutely no interest in playing team sports. But there is a sport, there's an activity for everyone, and it's finding that activity that you enjoy. And I would like to see more of these sports now becoming more mainstream, so it gives all of us. But for both young boys and girls, I think we have a huge problem, particularly after the age of 14 to 16. It is changing. We know that it's a huge issue. And I think it involves both our educational system and our sporting systems. I think our three big sporting organisations, the GEA, the FAI and rugby, I think my problem with those three is that they come in, they take all these kids in early. When they get to 14 or 15, the vast majority drop off. We need to have some form of athletic development programme. So when the kids arrive in a Saturday morning to a GEA centre to play Go games, that there's a wall there, they can throw a shot put, there's a hurdle, there's a high jump, there's wall climbing, there's lots of other activities.
There's something for everyone.
So when they drop out of Gaelic games later on, maybe they've developed the motor skills to be able to take part in some other sport. Because we're a small nation and the vast majority of our young talented athletes are going into those three sports.
Yeah, I myself had a high profile breakup with running. We've after much counselling we decided we're not a good fit, but I've taken up sea swimming instead, which and it's something I've seen hugely through in lockdown that people are doing. I want to come back to you, Joe, about how much is enough, because so many of us have been working from home, and if the trends continue, people will continue to do that. So we're sitting at our desks, and perhaps even more so, not getting up about, maybe going to meetings, meeting people. So what then, if you're looking at that 10,000 or whatever amount of steps, what should we be doing? Is it the shorter bursts? Like, you read a lot about how shorter bursts of activity might be as, you know, beneficial as 20 minutes, or this kind of, you know, high, you know, kind of hit or whatever. What's better for us?
The take-home message is that any exercise or any physical activity is better than being sedentary. And what is being sedentary? If you're sitting or lying, you're sedentary. If you're standing, you're physically active. If you're walking up a flight of stairs, you're physically active. And there are studies now showing that ideally we should get up every 20 to 25 minutes if we're sitting and just walk for 2 minutes. There's cardiometabolic benefits from that. It's the prolonged sitting, and we're spending too much time now, and particularly younger and younger kids are spending more and more time. In fact, I would rearrange classrooms. The kids should be allowed to stand up for every second class period, for the whole period. or maybe every 20 minutes they get up and they're allowed to walk around for 2 minutes. It's got to become a behaviour that's normal. It's not normalised to get up and walk every 20 minutes, but it should become a normal behaviour, because when we sit, we turn on what are called inactivity genes that result in us developing diseases. Whereas when we are physically active, we turn on thousands of totally different genes that reduce our risk for developing chronic diseases.
I nearly feel like pushing the mic up and standing up just to get into
I'm very disappointed you're not standing.
to get into the spirit of it all. Outline for us, we know a lot of them, but what happens if we're not? What are the risks if the lifestyle is too sedentary?
Well, the bottom line is you're going to develop the major chronic diseases that we spend 85 to 90% of our healthcare budget treating. Now think about that. We spend the vast majority of our budget treating diseases that are preventable. Cardiovascular disease, pulmonary disease, diabetes and certain forms of cancer. So if we're physically active, we can dramatically, now if we live long enough, the likelihood is we will develop, but we don't want to be developing chronic diseases, which is currently happening in our 20s and 30s and living the vast majority of our life in a state of ill health. We want to have a productive life. We want to compress our ill health into the last week of our life, and go quietly into the sunset. And that's not happening. People, like the vast majority of Irish people, but 64% of Irish people over the age of 45 are chronically medicated. They're on 5 or more medications a month. That's based on 2013 data. So that's not sustainable.
Yeah, it really isn't. And talk to me, look, I mean, obviously, I think if you were Education Minister for a day, you'd go in and radically overhaul our schools and have us standing and sitting at different intervals. But maybe just for our listeners, what practical tips can you give us in terms of increasing, just looking at Kelly Harrington, during lockdown, she would meet with neighbours and take them just on a walk. She would, set up little exercise lessons. But I suppose it's the little step that can mean a lot when you're looking at that longevity.
Well, let me give you 2 examples. There's a simple initiative run by Athletics Ireland called the Daily Mile, and where every kid in primary school has to walk or run a mile. Now, you could turn that into a relay. And you could have the slowest person maybe would have to run the shortest, and as they get fitter, they do more and more. So that's a simple example. There's also a secondary school in Donegal, and unfortunately their PE teacher died tragically, and I went up she was a former student in DCU, and I went to speak to the school, and they wanted to do something in her honour. And what they did, they decided to have a period during class time that every kid got the opportunity to walk or go out and exercise. And it transformed. In fact, the principal of the school told me that when some of the teachers were concerned that class time was being taken away, some of the female students came back and said, no, this is really making a difference to our physical and our mental health. And they were getting, from a social interaction perspective, as they were walking, they were talking to each other. There's 2 simple examples. In primary school, imagine getting up and learning a different exercise each week. So after 30 weeks of a school year, you have 30 different exercises you can do, and you take them with you for the rest of your life.
And if that's the education system, what can employers and others do? Because sometimes well-being is a bit of a box that you tick.
Yeah, and to be fair, companies are aware of this now because we've a highly educated workforce, and many of our graduates, they're looking for these sort of benefits. They want a program that will make a difference. The problem with the programs at the moment, and it's something we're trying to address, is that it's the worried well who participate in these programs. We need to get the bottom 30%, 35%, because if we can get the least sedentary, just doing some form of activity, we're not going to save millions. We're going to save billions in the long term. And they're the sort of strategies that we need to be implementing.
So if nothing else, the business, once the business as well as the moral case is made, it is there overwhelming. You'll be watching the match tomorrow, no doubt.
Indeed I will. Look, we need to be very careful that we don't put a gold medal, around Kelly's neck. It's going to be extremely difficult. All we have to remember is what was the previous one? Katie Taylor. I mean, that was a gladiator contest. It was, I didn't know who won the contest at the end. I've seen who she's fighting tomorrow. She is one tough opponent. So, it's going to be Kelly at her brilliant, brilliant best to win tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think you've learned most out of all of those years in high performance at DCU?
Anything is possible. Anything is possible. Anything.